welcome to our Interact online lesson. And today we're going to talk about a very specific topic, because normally we talk about, I would say, more tangible phenomena. And this time we'll be talking about illusion, and we're going to try and sneak through some of the nature's tricks. And I would like to convince you that polar regions in general, and we're mostly focusing on Arctic region, are a very specific place and very particular place where those elusive phenomena have meet very, very good conditions, and this is why they can be experienced quite often. Straciłam bycie prezenterem.
Tak, jest, widać prezentację.
Tak, ale tutaj próbuję. Wydaje mi się, że straciłam możliwość bycia prezenterem tej prezentacji. A nie, już wszystko wróciło. OK. Sorry. Well, maybe let's start with some basics of the tricks that are first caused by our mind, our brain construction. So the fact is that our brain is really deceiving us, and for many reasons. Not only our brain, our sense of sight is quite sensitive to illusions. So we're talking mostly about optical illusions, and they might have very different sources. So we tend to misinterpret an image, so it is misinterpreted by the brain. And it happens under the influence of contrast, of shadows, and they all automatically mislead our brain. So this type of illusion is like a result of some mechanism of perception. So under certain conditions, because normally those mechanisms help us in their perception, and under some certain conditions, they can produce apparently some fake impressions. So there are deceptions which deform shape, size, length in the illustration. And here are some of the examples. So on the right, we can see so-called Rubin's vase. So depending on what we, not even on what angle, from what angle we observe an image, you can either see two faces, two heads facing each other, or actually a vase observing the very same image. And it's quite difficult to see two of them at the same time. So you either at any given moment you see either those two faces, either this vase. On the left, on the other hand, a very famous image, I would say. So it's you can either see an old person, an old woman, or a young woman. And actually there are some interpretations, also psychological interpretations, on which image you see at first, but this is another story. But both, this is still the same image, but you can see two very different people. What else? A very famous Miller-Lyer illusion. So and sort of a riddle that is quite frequently asked. So which of the lines is longer, the one above or the one below? And actually their length is exactly the same, but because of those arrows, our brain tends to think that the one above is longer than the one below. What else? Oh, another famous illusion, so-called Poggendorff illusion, and this illusion illustrated here is it occurs when like the part of an image, a part of a line lying inside this gray rectangle is kind of removed from the line. So it appears like two parts of the line do not lie on a single straight line. And actually, this illusion is caused by our physiology of the visual system or of our sight, of this very important sense. So why it happens? Because our brain is quite often forced to interpret some scene without having full information, because it cannot perceive something clearly, so it tries to add missing points and missing elements, and they do not always represent the reality. Another one is this. The last example here is here on the right, and this is a sort of a pattern that makes us think that those lines are not parallel, but in fact they are parallel, even though it's really hard to believe at first. They seem to be in complete disorder. So what are the reasons? Like I said, our brain adding information it doesn't really perceive directly. So there are some lots of physiological mechanisms and phenomena that support those illusions, and some of those illusions are also have some cultural backgrounds, because we, in, let's say, Western European culture, we live in rectangular world full of angles, and so we tend to perceive some things in a certain way. But there was an experiment made with people of the Torres Strait, and people in this area live in round, like spherical houses. So there was a hypothesis put forward that we live in a rectangular civilization, so we perceive the world differently, and our optical illusions are different, because we are accustomed to perceive the shape of buildings as being rectangular, full of angles, room with angles. So we interpret things differently. And this was studied based on one of the examples of illusion here, which was this Miller-Lyer illusion. So people from Torres Strait area who are not used to rectangular civilization do not fall into this illusion. So this is how our mind tricks us. But today, however, we are going to talk about a slightly different type of illusions, also involving our senses, of course, but the ones that were certain conditions, environmental conditions, related mostly to distance and temperature, cause a particular game of light or other phenomena that create certain impressions. And they're not just impressions, they're perceptions of objects, and perception of objects that either are not really there or exist. Yeah, they truly exist, but are not in the location that we think they are, but are, for example, very, very, very far away, too far away, even behind the horizon line. So these phenomena are quite well known from deserts, for example. In deserts, we observe so-called mirages, and we distinguish two basic types of mirages. So there's a superior mirage and inferior mirage. And the superior, an example of superior mirage is so-called Fata Morgana. So the name comes from the Morgana fairy, from legends of King Arthur, and Fata Morgana is, I guess, one of the most well-known phenomena of the type that someone who's traveling through the desert in certain conditions can see an oasis that is not really there. I mean, it exists, but it's only an illusion that it is so close, and it can lead people to very dangerous situations, to losing themselves to this illusion. So the desert is one example, but we can also experience that simply on a highway, especially in a very hot day. So during this superior mirage, the image we observe, this fake image, is actually upside down. So what's the mechanism and what are the conditions behind it? So the trick lies in the density of air. So normally density of air decreases with increasing altitude. So the higher we get, the density is lower and lower due to its weight of the air. So, and the air above compresses the air below. So the density in the lower part is larger than in the upper part. So this is what normally happens, but above a very, very hot road, a very hot motorway, for example, there is often a layer of very warm air, which seems natural. And the density of warm air is normally lower than the density of the air above. So this time we have a very hot air with lower density, and then the density of the upper layer is higher. So the denser air sort of slows the light down. So, I mean, every air, each type of air slows the light down, but the denser air slows light down a little less than the air that is less dense. That might seem complicated. So this all is a question of refractive index of the air. So denser air has a slightly higher refractive index related to the air that is less dense. So this allows light to bend. So the light bends, and it bends from the warm air towards the cool air. So this is what we can observe here. I mean, I will just try and show you more directly. It's a laser pointer. So here's the sun, of course, and so the source of light, and this is how the light is refracted. So it's how it's bent by the air. So it's, as a result, we have a reflection of the sky, like a fake sky on the road, that we perceive it this way. And if you imagine traveling on a very hot day on a motorway, you'll see that the road in front of you might seem wet, like it rained a minute before. So it's not wet actually. It's the reflection of the sky that you observe. So it's like a sky above a truck, and again we perceive a sky to appear on the surface of the road, and then there's a road. So this road is not actually wet. So remember that the trick here was the density of air caused by a very specific phenomenon, a very hot day, so the surface of the road got really, really hot. So this is what it looks like. Exactly, I'm sure you observed it many, many times in the hot summer. But actually, we're going to focus on polar regions, like I said, polar regions are like very prone to such events, and it's easy to observe them there. So they're particularly often like a theater of such phenomena. And why is that? Normally, it's extremely cold out there. Not this. It's not the same temperature everywhere, and it's not that extremely cold all year round. But still, temperatures are extremely low. And that's not all, because there are also relatively large temperature differences between air layers and the surface, and most often the sea is also or traveling sea allows us to observe a lot of polar illusions, because the difference of temperature between the surface that surrounds us, which is sea, and the air is relatively large. We quite often observe the phenomena of inversion. So, like I said before, normally temperature of air drops down with altitude, and sometimes it's the other way around. So there are layers, lower layers that are colder than the upper layers, at least at some point in some areas. Another factor that allows those illusions to appear quite often in polar regions is the sea ice. So the sea ice, which is reflecting the light, the sunlight, so it has a very high albedo, and what is more important, there is a difference between this albedo of sea ice and the surrounding seawater water surface. So it also allows us to observe some particular phenomena. And again, the ocean, so the sea, the sea surface, and this game of light between sea ice and the ocean itself offers us such opportunities. And last but not least, still it's a very open spaces. As we know that there are people that live in the Arctic. Of course, not the whole area is empty. It's a little bit different in the Antarctic, because there are no countries, no civilization, only researchers and polar stations down there. But still, both polar regions are relatively empty and relatively free of so-called light pollution, right? So in other regions, especially especially in the cities, big cities, or around the cities, it is quite difficult to observe the real stars and the theater of the stars at night, because we are constantly polluted by light, because everything is going on 24/7. But in polar regions, there is a relatively low level of such pollution, and also there are lots of open spaces without buildings. And what buildings give us is a perspective. To our brain, it gives like a reference point. So our minds are not tricked that easily, because we have like stable, reliable points that we can refer to, that we know that are real. And with a very open space without any points of reference, actually it's much more difficult. About this this illusions, types of illusions, I mentioned mirages in general. So so-called upper mirages are most often observed in the northern countries, so in the Arctic. And so when the warm winds blow from the equator, so the warm air is transported from the equator in general towards the poles. So the upper layers of the atmosphere are heated and the low layers are cooled by ocean water masses, sea ice and snow. So this is why these areas are very much likely to have inversion, like that I mentioned before. And some phenomena, even though they're an amazing spectacle, can be actually easily explained, and they're not even optical illusions and can be explained intuitively. So at first we were surprised, but then we understand that nothing weird is going on. For example, the apparent smoking of the sea. So this is so-called the Arctic Sea smoke. It's called the Arctic Sea smoke, but it can be sometimes also observed, for example, or above or in the Baltic Sea, for example. It was observed quite a few times, and it's observed quite often in Poland. So at first, when you observe that, it seems like the sea surface must be burning. There must be some sort of fire, maybe a catastrophe. But how is the water on fire? But we soon noticed that it's not actually a smoke, it's actually a mist consisting of frozen water vapor that appears over the water surface, over the sea surface. So the water, which is relatively warm, remember, relatively large differences of temperature between the ocean layer, ocean surface, and the air. So the water is relatively warm. Relatively, it's not like 30 degrees, and it evaporates from the open surface into the air. And actually, one condition that needs to be met for this phenomenon to occur is that at least 10 Celsius degrees difference of temperatures. So the air must be at least 10 Celsius degrees colder than the water surface. So then the saturation state is like is exceeded, and this vapor condenses immediately. So we observe sea smoke most easily in the Arctic. Like I said, sometimes it's like a surprising event in the Baltic Sea. And it's explained here that this fog or this mist is observed above the open water surface. But let's get back to some optical illusions, and two most famous and also, I would say, historically significant of them are ice blink and water sky, so-called ice blink and water sky. So which one is which one, and which one is which, and what do they mean? They actually like the opposites. Ice blink is the opposite of water sky. And like I said, they played a very special historical role, and they're mostly known by those names, which are in English, which are associated with this unique water sea ice landscape of the Arctic Ocean. So we have ice blink and water sky. So the ice blink is a very bright, like whitish yellow glow, which is visible at the base of low clouds. So this is this image here, and it is more presented in detail here, right? So it's like a bright whitish yellow glow, which is visible at the base of clouds or low layer of clouds. And it occurs over a distant cluster of compact ice. So when sunlight penetrates a cloudy sky, it is reflected between the cloud layer and the surface of the air, of the sea, depending on what it encounters. And the water absorbs sunlight much more effectively than ice-covered surfaces. So we're referring to albedo here. So clouds over open water remain dark, It's quite easy to understand intuitively. While over ice-covered areas, the reflected light creates like bright, very bright spots. It's maybe not that visible here, but in nature, in real life, it's really astonishing. Uh, but where's the illusion here, right? We might say it's the fact. It's not an illusion. It's really is so that the ice reflects the sunlight more effectively. The thing is, we are astonished and we're alerted, as, let's say, as travelers, to what we can't see to the horizon line. So, and also, so we can see it from a very, very, very long distance. And also, a very relatively small area of this ice in the distance gives us a very significant, large, like exaggerated glare on the clouds. And this is why it is visible from the distance. So the water sky is, I guess, quite, since it's the opposite of ice blink, it's quite easy to understand and explain. So the water sky phenomenon refers to dark streaks on the lower surface of low clouds that we can observe here. So it indicates the opposite. So the presence of some open water free of sea ice, which is actually near the sea ice or is surrounded by the sea ice. So again, the sunlight reflects and sunlight is reflected more effectively by the ice than by the sea, by the water, the dark water itself, right? So why did I mention some historical role played by those illusions? So these phenomena were sort of natural lighthouses, nature's lighthouses, without lighthouses in the area, especially in the past. So they helped especially Inuit people, not only Inuit people, but Inuit people were traveling a lot with their kayaks they invented. So it was like indicating, okay, there is a water free of ice right there when they observed a water sky. And look out, there is sea ice in the distance when they observed an ice blink. So, but Inuits were not the only people who used this to operate, to navigate without any other sort of help of or lighthouses, maps, GPS, etc. So other people who used that were also those daredevils who were exploring, for example, the Northwest Passage, and it allowed them, or at least helped them to navigate safely. It was a warning of a dangerous ice that could be out of sight or even beyond the horizon and to change the course. So it was very precious once it was understood. So the illusion the illusion is actually this exaggeration of this phenomena. It allows us to observe something from the distance and on a very larger scale than the actual size of the sea ice or this free water. Okay. So I mentioned kayaks, and this is one of the type of the kayaks, and those kayaks traversed polar waters for more than 2,000 years. Of course, this is a photo from the early 20th century only. So we know from their records, their tales, and also some other records noted by European travelers how it was used. Actually, sometimes the ability to observe this phenomena or polar illusions in general did not prove to be very, very helpful. So it did improve safety, and observing ice blink and water sky. It did improve their safety levels, But for a long time, the search for the Northwest Passage was fruitless. As for Northwest Passage, I will not go into details about that. We have some separate materials on Northwest Passage and the search and exploration of Northwest Passage. In the late 18th century, after two centuries of searching, it was established that there was no continuous channel through which the passage of ships could be made unstopped and hindered. We might say that the safety was improved, but it wasn't allowed to navigate without any problems. But still, water scan and Asblink were helpful in general, right? And were like an indication. So they are very helpful and like positive, friendly optical phenomena, or innocent at least, because they were only exaggerating what actually existed. But actually, there are also some phenomena observed which to this day can be frightening, even if we understand, or at the very first moment where we observe them, we might be frightened. But imagine in the past where they were not understood completely. And again, how do we know? We have some tales, we have some records, we have some records of very different types, like journals of travelers, but also we have some tales, real tales or legends. So there's one tale, like medieval tale, which is called the King's Mirror, and it's a Viking's tale. And it describes Iceland and Greenland, and actually, even though it's not even a legend, it's a tale, and even though it's not a scientific record, it describes those places with almost scientific accuracy. But there are a few exceptions, and one of the exceptions is so-called Havgerdingar. Havgerdingar can be translated as a sea hedge. And so this is how the term is translated, and the sailors can be trapped, as they call it, in great danger, at great peril. Many believe that this is a real event that is being described, event or phenomenon, even though we don't fully have a full explanation which of the phenomena was it describing. So in general, in this Nordic saga, sea hedge was explained as something like a gigantic hedge appearing in the distance, and it could be really frightening because you're in the middle of the sea, no lighthouses, no nothing, and little to zero understanding how and I don't want to diminish their sailing abilities, but little to no understanding of general physical phenomena, even if they follow them intuitively. But at a certain point, you see a gigantic hedge out of nowhere, like a wall, even in the distance. So that might be really frightening, even for a very experienced and brave sailor. And this is a photo of probably of Havgerdingar. So this is it's not very modern, but it proves it is real. But what was the phenomenon? So for a very long time, it was explained like huge, as observing huge waves. That there were some earthquakes, but from undersea. And they caused huge waves, sort of tsunami wave. So this is what was the official interpretation still late 19th century, but not that long time ago, because in 2003, there was a different explanation of this phenomenon, and this was proposed by Len and Schroeder, and it was again a superior image and a superior mirage, just like Fata Morgana, which is known in desert areas. So again, we have different refractive indexes of air layers at different temperatures. And again, in Arctic, we encounter upper mirages, and they actually differ a little bit from those that we encounter in the desert, because desert mirages are upside down and they are actually lower than the original object. So you observe the oasis, but it's upside down, so the palms are upside down. And this phenomenon, like Harpendinger, for example, present the object as it is, without being upside down, and it appears actually to be higher, much higher to the observer. It appears to be much higher than the actual original object, because these are not total illusions. These are actual objects like lands, but that are below the horizon, that are very, very distant. And also they're again exaggerated because of the phenomenon that is opposite to desert Fata Morgana. They appear to be huge. And how this mirage is created? So again, the air layer near the surface is cooler, colder than the higher layers. Again, inversion, like I said. And the light is again curved towards the cooler and air which is denser. I already explained that. So even though there is an actual object, the object seems to be, sometimes it seems to be floating above the sea surface, and sometimes it appears to be very, very large. So it's, and normally it wouldn't be seen. This person would normally see this object here because it would appear beyond the horizon line. And this atmospheric refraction, like deflection of light, appears to lift the objects and make them huge. So this was probably an actual land, but the land that couldn't be perceived with naked eye, or even with some tools if they possessed them. Again, a historical role of those polar illusions. So they might be deceptive, they might be a little frightening. I mean, who wouldn't be frightened of huge hedges in the middle of the sea, out of nowhere? But undoubtedly, they, if the travelers were brave enough, curious enough, and inspired them to seek out some fabulous lands which are suspended above the sea surface. And probably it was thanks to those mirages that sailors, observed by the sailors, that sailors navigating the Arctic waters knew, or maybe not knew, suspected what laid beyond the horizon line. So, because why would they even expect anything, or a land or an island to appear anywhere near, to be reached by them with their limited boats or ships? So probably the explorers of Iceland may have reached Iceland because they were attracted by the mirage of the Faroe Islands. So they were traveling towards what they thought was near, and luckily they encountered Iceland, because otherwise they would or would not reach Faroe Islands. But Faroe Islands seemed to be closer due to those polar illusions. So they were fortunate enough to have Iceland on their path, on their way. So those, and we're quite certain of that because those mirages are like a regular part of the stories passed from generation to generation of especially of sailors, of people navigating through North Atlantic Ocean and also through the Arctic Ocean to the extent that they were able to. First explorers of Iceland probably thought they were looking for some mysterious land, which was Faroe Islands, which was further away. Again, it was further away because it was like almost 400 kilometers from Iceland. As for discovery of Greenland, it is suspected that Eric the Red must have had some idea that there is a land. He was not just going blindly. I mean, there were some earlier sightings of land there, but he or someone earlier must have had some idea there is something. We should seek land in that direction, in that particular direction. So actually, Eric the Red is famous for discovering Greenland, and I mean, at least from European point of view. And after his exile from Iceland, he headed directly towards the shores of Greenland. And under normal conditions, it is possible to see Greenland from Iceland, even from the highest peaks. But the logical explanation is that he had some information coming from the Arctic mirage, making Greenland appear to be closer. So he had some idea what hides behind the horizon. And there's also some suspicion, close to certainty, that because Vikings most certainly did reach North America, well, they did not invade America, but they did at least reach North America, and probably the arrival to America was also linked to this phenomena. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to suspect there's something there. But not everyone was as fortunate as the Vikings. And it was actually in times much closer to our times and much more contemporary. And when people had much more, maybe not GPS that we have now, of course, but some more developed technology than the Vikings or the Inuit people. But it was a time that was certainly associated with a very intense exploration of polar regions. It was like the wild era of exploration. Everyone was racing everyone else. Who will be first? Who will be the first to reach North Pole, South Pole, or explore this region or this region? So that it was like a snow fever or ice fever, maybe, like analogy to gold fever. So in 1819, there were two English sailors, brothers, James and John Ross, and they reported that during their journey, they had spotted an unknown landmass covered with mountains near Baffin Island. It's a region of northern Canada. Well, it took some time for other people to get interested, and I guess about 25 years later, the same land was spotted by a very serious person, an admiral, Matthew Perry. And he actually gave this land a name. He named it Crocker's Land. In 1913, the American Museum of Natural History decided to sponsor exploration expedition to explore this new land. So they commissioned Donald Macmillan to lead this expedition to find the unknown land, and they were really well prepared. And they had even, I think you can see here some bags for samples from the land. So it was all very scientifically based, right? And the search initially brought no results. So they knew where the mysterious land was supposed to be located, and but where they came there were only ocean waters. So they navigated the place, went around and around, and many kilometers to the west, they actually saw the land. Not where they expected, but they saw the land, and actually with a large chain of mountains. So it seemed very, very real. So the Macmillan, he sent a few men, a few sailors towards it, but they were approaching the land in a boat, and the land seemed to be running away from them. They were approaching it, so this chase lasted. Sometimes the faster they moved, the faster the land seemed to be moving away. When they stopped, the land stopped. So I think that it lasted all day, this chase. And actually, the sun went down, and the chain of mountains disappeared completely with it. It was nowhere to be seen. So they were looking at each other, astonished, and suddenly they realized that the nature played a joke on them, on the museum, and on the people before them. So Crocker's lamp never really existed. It was only a mirage, probably similar to this one. It's a contemporary photo, because it was a combination of clouds and snow that seemed to be like a solid land with mountain chains, observed in the very same location by people in a quite long time span, right? But actually, so they did not come back in glory like other explorers, but this expedition was not entirely fruitless, and they gathered some rock samples, not from Crocker Land because it did not exist, but they brought back some samples from other Canadian islands, and also some bird migration routes were observed. So I think it's a great topic for a movie. Actually, I wonder if it there is a book, but it's a mirage expedition of search of land that never actually existed. And we're coming slowly to an end, and I would like to just mention a very unique kind of Arctic mirage, and it's called the Novaya Zemlya, new land, or effect. It's particularly mysterious and very spectacular and very, very rare one. And it was first observed, at least we know it was first observed and noted during a very tragic attempt by the Dutch to conquer the Northeast Passage this time. It was a third attempt, and they ended tragically. And information about this phenomenon survived thanks to a diary kept by expeditions chronicler, and the expedition was famous because it was famous for the discovery of Spitsbergen and Bear Island, and the navigator of this expedition was Willem Barents, but he paid his life for the expedition, so he died there. So their ship was crushed by ice, and the sailors were trapped. And eventually Barents died of scurvy in 1597. So the surviving crew members escaped this ice trap, and some of them survived in lifeboats. But what was observed and what was noted in journals was very interesting. So what was noticed is darkness reigned all around us, a terrifying darkness, nowhere to hope for daylight. This is what the chronicler wrote. And in this overwhelming darkness, remember it's a polar night, so it needs to be dark. On the 24th January 1597, a miracle happened, a miracle they all prayed for. So 2 weeks before the predicted return of the sun after the polar night, and they were already able to calculate it, and they knew what to expect and when to expect the sun. they were very exhausted, they were sick and hungry, and so suddenly they saw a bright, strong sunlight. So at first they suspected that they had hallucinations because they were so sick and hungry. Then they thought, okay, we all see the same thing. We can't be hallucinating the same thing. So probably we made a mistake. We miscalculated the time. But then the right light reappeared. So when they returned, at least some of them survived and returned, there's testimony that they did see sun 2 weeks before it should be there. It was all questioned. So it was said they might have been mistaken. So they miscalculated and so on. So it was put on hold. And then I mean, 3 centuries later, another famous polar traveler experienced the phenomenon. But this time it was not around Novaya Zemlya, it was in the south. It was at the southern ends of it, and the explorer was none other than Ernest Shackleton, the famous Ernest Shackleton. And during his very last Antarctic expedition, in the beginning of 20th century, he saw the sun again 7 days after it was last seen. So after it was below the horizon. Then again, he saw it 2 months later, 5 days before it was supposed to come back. So he wasn't miscalculating. He wasn't wrong and he wasn't hallucinating. But still, nothing proven, nothing set in stone. But it was not until the 1956, after another observation of the effect, that it was proven after more than 300, almost 400 years, to be an actual physical phenomenon. So, new Novaya Zemlya effect, new land, new earth effect, is apparent appearance of the sun during the polar night. And it is a result of formation of a very peculiar channel, optical channel, in the lower layer of the atmosphere. Again, we're talking about inversion layers, strong temperature inversion. So we have colder air below and relatively warm layer above, even though we expect it otherwise. But this time the inversion layer needs to be very, very, very thick, at least 400 kilometers. So this is why it is so rare. It was only observed, at least noted by Barents, Shackleton, then in 1956. So when this channel of 400 kilometers is created, the light is captured. It is captured below this thermocline, and it is visible, although for the observer, the sun is below the line. So this is actual position of the sun. This is the observer who shouldn't be able to see it. But the apparent position of the sun is here because of this atmospheric layer, and again, light bending. I'll just end quickly with a very quick reference to other phenomena which are actually described in many books, such as Bible. Again, they were physical phenomena were incomprehensible for our ancestors. They seemed very powerful, frightening, and could be only explained by supernatural powers. And they are very beautifully described, for example, like the book of Ezekiel. And there have very different interpretations, not only Ezekiel, other prophets as well. So they're mostly, some people interpret them as aliens visiting the earth. But actually, more and more often, those light-related, like chariots of fire phenomena described in the Bible by Ezekiel, for example, are interpreted as a view of so-called sun dog, or in other words, parhelion, which is another deceptive mirage, and or which makes us think that we see two side suns on the left and on the right from the actual sun. Of course, there are no three suns. There's only one sun, but what we see is a reflection of the sun, and the reflection is observed in the ice crystals in the south. So if ice crystals are hexagonal, then the reflection creates this sort of halo, this sort of image of sun on the left and on the right from the actual source of light. So the ice crystals act like prisms. They are bending the light, passing through them. Again, it's quite rare, but can be observed as well. And yeah, on this note, thank you very much for today. I hope I was trying to show at least some of the most often or most known polar illusions, and I hope you're inspired to explore more of them. Thank you.
Tak. Tak, thank you for... tak, no. Czy mogę po polsku, czy...
We have guests who are from other countries actually. Czy ma pan jakieś pytanie, tak?
No tak, nie, po prostu bardzo dziękuję za wykład i w ogóle... no, są opisy bardzo... tak, bardzo mi pomogły zrozumieć, ale tak bardzo ciekawe, nie spodziewałem się na przykład tej Biblii.
No, w Biblii jest sporo takich opisów, które oczywiście nie są jednoznaczne interpretacje. So I was just mentioning that there are lots of other phenomena that are described in the Bible, and not all people or also not all researchers are in accordance what they actually represent, but this Ezekiel and Parhelion is one of them, and one of the most known. So thank you very much, and see you next time.